Thank you all for having me here. It's an honor to be a speaker in this series. I know that many wonderful people are speakers this year and have been speakers in the past, and so I'm really thrilled to be part of this series. And when Lynn invited me to be a part of this series, she proposed that January or February would really be the ideal time, given the rest of the lineup. And I thought, well, let's do late February. She was pushing the True False Film Festival, which you may have heard of, which I plan to attend a couple days of. But also I thought, well, late February, I bet in Missouri, by then it's, sorry, maybe I have to turn this one off. I'm good? Okay. I bet by late February it'll be spring in Missouri. That was a miscalculation. But I'm really thrilled to be here. And in connection with the theme of the entire series on the need to belong, I'm going to take as a starting point the assumption that humans are social animals. I don't think that needs a lot of defense. And that we need social connections with other human beings to survive and thrive. Oh, I know what I didn't do is put this into presenter view, sorry. There we go. There we go. So in 1995, Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary wrote a review of the evidence that human beings have a pervasive drive to form and maintain at least a minimum quantity of lasting, positive, and significant social relationships, interpersonal relationships. And absent satisfaction of this need, human beings' health and well-being suffer. So many different types of relationships can be lasting, positive, and significant. For example, we often think of romantic relationships, which sometimes end in marriage, or actually could convert to marriage, I should say. And sometimes they actually last, and sometimes people have children. Parent-child relationships can be positive and significant lasting relationships. And of course, there's all the friendships that we form, just as a few examples. So the friendships that we form in grade school, and sometimes they last through high school and high school trips to foreign lands. And some of those relationships and friendships that we form early in our lives, for example, with people that we room with in college, can last a very long time. So, for example, these four guys were roommates in their freshman year of college, and they have remained friends ever since. They get together at least once a year just to enjoy each other's company. And this photograph was taken at their 50th college reunion. So we know that having high-quality relationships is really good for our health and well-being. Of course, not all relationships are high in quality. Some of them are ambivalent, some of them are negative, some of them don't last. But it does appear that we need a few close, caring, and supportive relationships in order to flourish and thrive. So what I want to do today is address two questions about the fundamental human need to belong. First of all, how can we get these close, caring, and supportive relationships? That is, where do they come from? I really am just going to make two very simple points, and then I'm going to get very complicated about the data in support of those points. But the first very simple point that I want to make today is that it starts with us, that we can create or we can undermine close, caring, and mutually supportive relationships with people we care about and who care about us. So we don't have to wait for other people to include us, to care about us, to offer support to us, and to make us feel like we belong. That it's actually in our power to create support, responsiveness, and belonging. So I'm going to describe research today that shows that the goals that we have in our relationships with other people can either create or undermine close, mutually supportive relationships. So that's my first simple point. I actually have a slide for this, sorry. So how can we create close and caring relationships? Then the second question I want to address is, what is it about these relationships that actually is good for our health and well-being? And I want to consider two alternatives. One of those is whether it's what we receive from our relationship partners that enhances our health and well-being. That is, the support they give us, how responsive they are to our needs, the way that they care about us. Is that what's promoting our health and well-being? That's generally the assumption that's made in the psychological literature about the value of close relationships for our health and well-being. But I want to compare that to an alternative possibility that it's not what we receive from our relationship partners, but rather what we give to them that's actually good for our health and well-being. That maybe what's driving the effects of close relationships on health and well-being is not what we get personally out of them, but what we give to other people that's actually directly good for our well-being. So the main point I want to make, so let me turn to the first question, which is how can we create close and caring relationships? And the main point I want to make is that the goals we have for our relationships shape our emotional experience, our construals, how we think about those relationships, and the support that we perceive is available to us, as well as the support we actually give to other people and receive from other people, how responsive we are to other people, and how responsive they are to us. So our goals actually create the quality, whether good or bad, of our relationships, both for ourselves and for our relationship partners. So let me back up a little bit here. What kinds of goals are we talking about? In my research, I look at two different types of goals, as Lynn mentioned. I call them compassionate and self-image goals. So one type of goal, self-image goals, are focused on managing the impressions that other people have of us. So when people have these goals, they're trying to get other people to see their positive qualities, or they're trying to construct desired images in the eyes of other people. They want others to get their positive qualities. So if I can get you to see my positive qualities, and I can prevent you from seeing my dreaded qualities, Lord knows I have a few, then you will have high regard for me, you will be responsive to my needs, and you will help me get my needs satisfied. So the idea with these self-image goals is that they're a strategy, an interpersonal strategy to get my own needs met by controlling how it is, the impressions that other people have of me, so they will then give me what I want, and perhaps even what I need, right? So it's a way to get things from other people. So the second kind of goal I've studied in my research reflects, I think, a different kind of orientation toward other people, which is the goal of being supportive and constructive for others. So whereas self-image goals are focused on what do I need and how can I get you to give me what I need, and how can I manipulate or control the impressions you have of me so that I can get my needs met. The second goal is the goal, what I call them compassionate goals. It's the goal to be constructive and supportive for other people. So it's not worried about my own needs, but what can I do to be helpful to you or supportive or constructive in this situation? So in this system, these goals are about you and what do you need from me and how can I be a positive influence in this situation. So I think that these two goals reflect very fundamentally different motivational orientations. So one of them I call the ecosystem. And in the ecosystem, people are essentially trying to take from other people. They're trying to get other people to give them what they want or need. So in the ecosystem, people construct these desired images of themselves. They try to say things that are brilliant to get other people to see how smart they are, or they avoid acknowledging when they're confused or totally not understanding so that other people won't see that they're unintelligent. But they're doing that to try to get something from other people. And that other thing might be admiration or a sense of belonging or respect from other people. And this motivational orientation is associated with a distinct set of experiences and interpersonal processes. So experientially, when people have, so first of all, it's associated with having self-image goals, right? That's the primary goal that, or one of the primary goals that captures this motivational orientation. And when people have this goal, they're trying to take things from other people, and they tend to experience feeling ill at ease. So they feel conflicted, they feel sometimes confused, they often feel fearful because they're afraid that they won't be able to control how other people see them, and therefore they won't get their needs met, right? So it's an uneasy emotional experience people have when they have this motivational orientation. They also tend to see their relationships differently. So people in this frame of mind, in this motivational perspective, they're trying to get something from other people by constructing these desired images. So they tend to have zero-sum or win-lose beliefs about their relationships with other people, right? So if I get what I want and need, then you won't get what you want and need, and vice versa. So I'm trying to take something from you, and I recognize that it might be at your expense, but hey, that's the way the world works, right? So in order to get my needs met, I've got to do so at the expense of other people. And it's associated with a set of interpersonal processes too. So in this kind of motivational system, the role of other people is to be convinced and controlled or manipulated, manage their impressions so that I'll get my own needs met. So it's very self-focused. Even though other people are in the picture, they're in the picture as serving my own needs. And so in this framework, people are not particularly inclined to give support to other people. And when they do, it's usually to manage the impressions of other people, right? To get other people to like them or appreciate them and so on. They're likely to be less responsive to other people's needs, right? They're not really thinking about, what do you need? They're just thinking about, oh, what do you think about me so I can get my own needs met, right? So there are these interpersonal dynamics that tend to go with this motivational perspective. And I contrast that with what I call an ecosystem motivational perspective. So in this framework, people aren't worried about, it's not that they're martyring themselves or sacrificing themselves for other people, they're just not so worried about getting their own needs met. So their goal is to be supportive and constructive, to give to others, so they have what we call compassionate goals. And these are also associated with a distinct set of subjective experience, emotions, construals of relationships, and interpersonal behaviors. So when people have this goal, they're not so worried about managing the impressions that other people have. They don't view their own needs as any more important than other people's needs. They're focused on, oh, what do you need right now, and how can I respond to that? So they give to others, but not in a martyring way. As I said, they trust that eventually, if they're living in a system where people's needs are being satisfied, then their own needs will also be met, right? So it's not a zero-sum view of relationships. It's a non-zero-sum. I can give, and it won't be bad for me, right? It will be good for everybody. They feel more cooperative with other people. They feel more at ease with other people, right? So they're not in a competition. They're not trying to take something from other people. Things can be good for you and good for me. And so it leads to a set of emotional experiences in relationships that are more peaceful. You feel more clear. You feel more connected to other people. So a different set of emotional experiences, a different way of construing what these relationships are about, and also different interpersonal behaviors. So in this motivational orientation, people should be more supportive of others. That would be a direct prediction, more responsive to other people's needs. But they shouldn't, that shouldn't necessarily be at their own expense. So one thing I want to note, a couple things I want to note is that, of course, everybody has both of these motivational orientations. It's not like some people are one and other people are the other. We're all both. We're all back and forth between those two. So these are states, psychological states, as well as personality traits. They fluctuate within people. And you can have both at the same time. So one of the times I experience this is often when I'm giving a talk. I want to appear competent, right? I want to do I don't want to look like an idiot in front of a group of people who invited me to give a talk. And at the same time, I would like to say something that would be helpful and constructive and useful to you, right? So it's certainly possible, and in our data, we always see that people tend to have both of these orientations at the same time, right? They certainly have both of these goals at the same time. Okay, so The research. In the research that I'm going to talk about to you today, we do longitudinal studies of college freshmen, usually in their first semester of college, and look at what their experience is over the first semester of college. So the reason we do that is many of these things that I've argued are associated with the ecosystem and ecosystem perspectives. They could either be the cause or the effect. For example, having a self-image goal could be a consequence of feeling uneasy in a relationship and not the cause of feeling uneasy in a relationship. Having a zero-sum view of relationships where it's win-lose could be a consequence of having a self-image goal, or it could be a cause of having a self-image goal. So it's important to try to get a handle on in what direction are these associations working, assuming that we find the associations. So in our research, the research is longitudinal. We look at things over time, so we can look at how things are changing and what's predicting change in the relationship over time. It's also relational in the sense that in two of the studies I'm going to draw data from today, we're actually looking at this in the context of close relationships, and in particular in the context of college freshman roommate relationships, which are a particularly interesting place to look at relationship dynamics because these are people in our studies, they can't have known each other before college, right? So it's a new relationship. You're throwing two people together pretty much at random. I mean, they can choose whether they're going to be paired with a smoker or a non-smoker, but they're more or less thrown together at random. And we can look at how the relationship unfolds over time, over the first semester of college, and what's happening in their relationship. And we can also look at dynamic processes. So how does one person's goal, for example, affect what's happening to the other person? And does that, in fact, come back and affect the first person in the relationship, in the roommate relationship? So the research is longitudinal, relational, and dynamic as a way to try to get a handle on these processes. So what about these goals? The first thing we needed to do when we wanted to study these processes and the consequences of having these goals is to develop a measure of compassionate and self-image goals. So we've done that. We've used various versions of this in any number of studies now. So just to give you a flavor of what these goals look like, our self-image goals items are things like in general, or in the past day, or in the past week, how much did you want to or try to get other people to notice your positive qualities or avoid showing your weaknesses? So we've tried to balance, for those of you who worry about sort of the scale composition, we've tried to balance approach and avoid items. So what are you trying to do and what are you trying not to do in your self-image goals? And our compassionate goals items are things like how much did you want to or try to be supportive of others or avoid doing anything that would be harmful to others. So again, both approach and avoidance items in the compassionate goals scale. So in the studies themselves, I'm going to describe to you data from 3 of these longitudinal studies of college freshmen. One of them was a study in which we recruited students. In this study, it was as soon as they arrived on campus, and they participated individually. So this is not a relationship study, but we brought them to campus, we measured their goals, and we measured a whole bunch of other things. And then we had them fill out surveys online every week for 10 weeks, and then they filled a post-test. So a lot of the data, some of the data I'm going to present to you today comes from that longitudinal study. In another study, we followed that up with a more detailed study of college roommate dyads. So we recruited freshman roommate pairs who didn't know each other before college and had them fill out a set of pretest measures, including our goals measure. And then every day for 21 days, both of the roommates filled out the same set of questions about themselves and about their roommate. So we could look at what's happening in their roommate relationship over time, daily, for 21 days, and then they fill out a post-test questionnaire. And then in the third study, we kept the roommate paradigm, right? So we're still studying pairs of roommates, but we then went back to a more extended period of time where every week for 10 weeks, they're filling out a series of online questions with a pretest and a post-test. So I'm going to try to present the findings in the way that, to me, makes logical sense rather than here's study 1, study 2, study 3. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth between these 3 studies. I'm not going to go back and revisit a lot of detail. If you urgently need the detail to understand what I'm talking about, please let me know, and I'd be happy to try to clarify things. And I'm also not going to go into any detail about the data analysis. So in these data, we have longitudinal data, so we use multi-level modeling, particularly in the modeling of dyads. We have individuals nested within dyads and crossed with days, and we do all the appropriate modeling techniques in order to capture that non-interdependence in the data. But I'm not going to try to explain all the ins and outs of that to you. So again, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them later or send you the manuscripts that report the details of the data analysis. Okay, so our first question had to do with, how do these goals affect your own subjective experience? And we started with, how do these goals affect how you feel when you're interacting with other people? So these data come from the 21-day longitudinal study where we had measures day after day of students and their roommates, and we asked students every day, what's your goal? How much did you want to or try to get your roommate to see your positive qualities, avoid doing anything that would be harmful to your roommate, right? So we measured compassionate and self-image goals for the roommate relationship every day for 21 days, and we also asked students to report how did they feel when they were interacting with their roommate that day, right? And so we had three emotion items that we thought might be related to each of these goals. So as I said earlier, we thought that when people have self-image goals, they're going to feel more anxious or fearful. They're going to feel more conflicted. They're going to feel more confused. It's like it's not clear how I can control how you see me, what you think about me. My needs are kind of at the expense of your needs, so how do I balance that out? So they're going to have these sort of agitated and uneasy feelings when they interact with their roommates. On the other hand, we thought that when you have compassionate goals, your needs are aligned with the other person. You don't see things in a zero-sum way, and so you may feel much more peaceful, clear, and connected with other people. So in the study, what we did, and again, we wanted to look at the direction of the fact, not just our goals associated with having these feelings, but that they actually predict change in the feelings that you experience when you interact with somebody else. And so we looked at whether self-image goals on one day, and we did this across all the possible pairs of sequence of days within the data set, but do self-image goals on one day predict feeling increases, residual change, increases in how fearful you feel when you're interacting with your roommate from that day to the next day. And sure enough, they do. They predict controlling for how fearful you feel on day one. When you have self-image goals, that predicts feeling more fearful when you interact with your roommate on day two. Also predicts feeling more confused from day one to day two, and more conflicted from day one to day two. So these are partial correlations for those of you who want to know what the coefficients are. On the other hand, when students had compassionate goals for their relationship with their roommate, compassionate goals one day predicted increases in feeling peaceful the following day, feeling more clear the following day, and feeling more connected the following day. So these goals are actually seem to be predicting change in how it is that people feel when they interact with other people. And they feel more connected when they have these goals that are more about supporting the well-being of another person. So then we wanted to know, do these goals have any implications for how people construe their relationships, right? And I talked before about sort of seeing your relationships as zero-sum or non-zero-sum in quality. So a zero-sum view is, well, I'll show you some items, but in a zero-sum view of relationships, when one person wins, the other has to lose. That's just, the way it is. Finite amount to go around, there's winners and losers. Whereas a non-zero-sum view of a relationship is, it's possible to have outcomes that are good for both of us, right? It can be good for you and good for me. So we first had to create a measure of, this is one of the things I'm fond of doing, is creating items. We create a measure of these non-zero-sum beliefs in close relationships, right? Can you actually have zero-sum versus non-zero-sum beliefs in close relationships, or are all close relationships very non-zero-sum by necessity? So our non-zero-sum items are things like, when a conflict occurs, it's possible to find a situation that's good for both people, and it's usually possible to resolve disagreements in mutually beneficial ways. And our zero-sum items are things like when one person gets what he or she wants, the other person usually suffers. Or what's good for one person is often bad for the other. And they were asked these questions in the context of roommate relationships. So these two kinds of items are strongly connected to each other, so we combine them to an overall index of non-zero-sum beliefs about roommate relationships. And again, we were interested in whether goals at one time would predict change in these beliefs at a subsequent time. So here we used data from our roommate weekly study, right, the third study I described to you. And so we looked at whether compassionate goals and self-image goals on 1 week predicted residual change in non-zero-sum beliefs the following week. Right, so are we predicting change over time and what people actually believe about how relationships work, how roommate relationships work. And sure enough, when people have compassionate goals on 1 week, they're more likely to have non-zero-sum beliefs the following week. And that's controlling for non-zero-sum beliefs on week 1. So we're predicting residual change from week 1 to week 2 in the beliefs they have about how their roommate relationships work. And likewise, self-image goals on 1 week actually predict decreases in non-zero-sum beliefs or increases in zero-sum beliefs in how roommate relationships work over time. So we usually think that, and psychologists are prone to believe that our beliefs shape our goals, right? We have a certain set of beliefs about how the world works, and that determines what our goals are. But in fact, here what we're finding is that the goals that we have are predicting change in the beliefs that we have about how the social world actually works. And just also, we also looked at this over a much longer time interval. So can we predict change in non-zero-sum beliefs about roommate relationships at the end of the semester from the goals that people reported having at the start of the semester, right? So here we measured compassionate goals and self-image goals at pretest, right, at as early as we could get these roommate pairs into our study. And then we measured their beliefs at pretest and then at post-test, which was 10 to 12 weeks later. So can actually a goal you express, the second or third week of your arrival on campus at the University of Michigan, actually predict change in your beliefs about how roommates relationships work 12 weeks later? And they do. These effects are not as strong, but in both cases they're significant. Goals at time 1 are predicting residual change. That is, they're predicting non-zero-sum beliefs at time 2, controlling for what you believed at time 1. Self-image goals predict decreases in non-zero-sum beliefs, and compassionate goals predict increases in non-zero-sum beliefs. All right, so far what we've seen is that these goals seem to predict change in your emotional experience, and they predict change in your beliefs about how relationships work. The next thing I want to describe to you is another variable. It's not so clear if this is something that's happening intrapsychically or interpersonally, right? So do your goals actually predict change in the support that you believe is available to you, right? So this could be something that's happening inside your head, or it could be something that's actually happening inside your social relationships, that your goals are predicting change in your perception that you have support available. So in this case, we're going back to the individual study. This was before we looked at this issue before we actually looked at dyads. And in our individual study of roommates over the first semester of college, we looked at whether their chronic goals, right, the average goals they had over the 10 weekly reports, predict change from pretest to post-test in the support they perceive as available to them. So now things are going to get a little bit more complicated because instead of having just main effects of the goals, the two goals that we study actually interacted with each other. That is, the effect of compassionate goals on change in perceived available support depended on whether you had self-image goals. You were high or low in self-image goals. So let me show you what that looks like. So this is the effects of compassionate and self-image goals on change in the support you perceive as available to you from friends. And so we have compassionate goals, high or low, and I'm going to plot the lines for students who are low in self-image goals and for those who are high in self-image goals. And you can see when students were low in self-image goals, then the more compassionate goals they had, the more support they thought was available to them at the post-test, at the end of the semester, controlling for how much friend support they thought was available to them at the beginning of the semester. So you following this? Right? So this makes sense, right? You have a compassionate goal. These are people who, care about being supportive to others. It actually predicts increases in the support they think is available to them, right? Very nicely. What happens when they tend to be high in self-image goals? Well, the effect of compassionate goals is attenuated. That is, this line is flatter. So having self-image goals seems to attenuate or reduce the beneficial effect of having compassionate goals on change in perceived available support. So if you have both goals, that's high compassionate goals and high self-image goals, you don't experience the same benefit in perceiving that support is available to you as you do when you have compassionate goals without having self-image goals. Okay, so are you with me? Clear? Okay. So we thought this was really interesting, but we really wondered at this point how much of this is just in our students' heads. So these are individuals, we didn't have dyads. How much of it really is in their heads, and how much of it is something that actually happens in their relationships? And if it's in their relationships, can we provide evidence for that? So after we did this study, we did our first roommate study where we looked at roommates every day for 21 days. And we measured, again, social support at the beginning and end of the study. But this time, instead of asking people how much support do you perceive is available to you, we asked students how much support do you give to your roommate and how much support did you receive from your roommate. And we had both roommates give us those reports. So we have each of them telling us how much they gave and how much they received. So we can look at whether when one person says, yes, I increased in the amount of support that I gave, does the other person actually believe it, right? Do they perceive it? So here we're actually looking at the interpersonal process of support given to and received from roommates. And again, we're plotting for low self-image goals people and high self-image goals people. What are the effects of having these compassionate goals on residual change? This is again from the beginning to the end of the study, this time over 3 weeks, in the support that students give and students receive. So we're going to start with the support that people said they received. So we've leapt to a slightly different kind of analysis here, because what we have is one roommate's goals, what they told us their goals were, predicting change in the other person's reports of support they received. So we're using one person's independent variable from one person to predict change in a dependent variable from another person. And what we see again, consistent with our perceived available support effect, is that the more that, I'm going to call these actors and partners, the roommates are all same sex, so it's hard to talk about them. So when actors were high in compassionate goals, then roommates reported receiving more support from actors at post-test, controlling from the support they reported receiving from actors at pre-test. So actors' compassionate goals are predicting increases, larger residual change in the support that their roommates experience receiving from them, right? So the roommates are saying, yeah, I am actually getting more support. But when actors had self-image goals, that effect goes away, right? So when actors were high in self-image goals, their roommates were not reporting receiving more support, in spite of the fact that actors might also have had high compassionate goals. So there's something about the self-image goals that actually undermines the other person's experience of receiving support. So then we looked at what happens with, do actors' goals actually predict change in the support that their partners, roommates, report giving back to actors? Right? So does one person's goals report change in what the other person says they gave back? And again, looking at the same kind of analysis, we see that actors' compassionate goals predict residual change in how much support their roommates said they gave back to actors, but only if actors were low in self-image goals. When actors were high in self-image goals, that effect completely goes away. So again, there's something about when actors have self-image goals, they totally undermine the beneficial effects of their compassionate goals on their roommates' experience of receiving support, and also their roommates' reports of the support they gave back to actors. So we also had actors' reports of the support they got back from their roommates. So when we put all of this together into one model, what we can see is that those are just the two graphs I just showed you. Actors, compassionate, and self-image goals interact with each other. And here, the different color squares mean the data came from a different person. They interact to predict change, that's the delta, in the support that partners report receiving from actors. And then in a path model, so controlling for actors' goals, change in the support partners receive predicts change in the support that partners report giving. And that's a really strong association. So when you think you're getting more, then you also give more. It's a 0.79. It's really strong effect there. And when partners report giving more support, actors report receiving more support, right, across the period of the study. So you get a nice interpersonal dynamic in which, starting with actors' goals, their goals predict change in what their roommate is experiencing, what their roommate experiences in terms of what they receive predicts change in what the roommate gives back, which in turn predicts change in what actors receive. So this is the non-zero-sum nature of relationships when you have compassionate goals, right? That you actually do get back from the person that you're giving to. They notice that you give, but it only happens when you don't have self-image goals, right? It happens as a function of compassionate goals, but not if you also have self-image goals. All right, so we wanted to dig more deeply into the dynamics of these roommate relationships. So we went into that 21-day daily diary study, and we looked at what was happening from day to day in the relationship in that study. And we focused on a variable called responsiveness, which is really typically defined as a combination of understanding, caring, and validation. So when people are responsive to their roommates, they're saying, I really tried to understand my roommate, I really cared about my roommate, I really validated my roommate today. So, and again, we're looking at this in a study where we have roommate dyads, where we have both people's reports. So we had both of them give us their reports of how responsive they were to their roommate and how responsive their roommate was to them. So just to give you a feel for what that looks like, my responsiveness to my roommate items were things like, I behaved warmly toward my roommate today, or I really listened to my roommate when he or she talks. And then we just have the same items, they're reporting the same behaviors on the part of their roommate back toward them. So my roommate behaved warmly toward me, and my roommate really listened to me when I talked, right? So these are examples of responsive behaviors that they're both reporting on every day for 21 days. And what we looked at, again, as always, is how actors' goals are predicting change. So starting with actors' goals, are they predicting change in how responsive actors are toward their roommates from one day to the next? Again, this is predicting day 2 responsiveness, controlling for day 1 responsiveness. And we find, indeed, that when on days actors have compassionate goals, they're reporting being more responsive the following day, controlling for how responsive they were the first day. And when they have self-image goals, they report being less responsive the following day. Right? So it seems like actors with compassionate goals are more responsive to their roommates, and actors with self-image goals are less responsive to their roommates. And then we wanted to know, does that change in responsiveness that actors are reporting from one day to the next, are partners actually perceiving? Are they noticing that change in responsiveness? So controlling for actors' goals now, we look at whether change in actors' responsiveness is predicting change in their partners' reports of their responsiveness. And it turns out that it does. So this partial correlation of 0.83, you would think it's like we're just measuring the same thing twice, right? But these reports are actually coming from 2 different people, and it's residual change, right? So it's the residual change in responsiveness from that one person reports is predicting residual change in the responsiveness their roommate reports at a partial correlation of 0.83. And then we looked at whether this change in partners' perceptions of actors' responsiveness has consequences, right? So what does it mean to partners if they're perceiving that the actors are actually more responsive? We found that, first of all, we looked at whether change in partners' perceptions of actors' responsiveness is actually predicting change in partners' responsiveness right back, right? You give it back, and it turns out that you do. So we're now on predicting day 3 partner responsiveness, controlling for day 1 partner responsiveness. And we also looked at whether change in partners' perceptions of actors' responsiveness predicts change in partners' relationship quality. And it does. So on day 3, partners are saying that their relationship quality is higher than they did on day 1 when they perceive that actors are more responsive to them. And we also looked at change in partners' compassionate goals, because that could then start the same cycle all over again, starting with the other person. And in fact, the more that partners thought that actors had gotten more responsive to them, the more partners were likely to have compassionate goals for their relationship with the actor. So then you can start all over again with partners now being the day 1 data. And you can see how you can get a positive dynamic happening in these relationships over time. So, so far, the conclusions that I would like to draw from these data are that the goals that we bring to our relationships with other people affect our experience of those relationships, our understanding of how those relationships actually work. Do they work in a zero-sum fashion or a non-zero-sum fashion? And they predict what happens in those relationships, how supportive and responsive people are in those relationships. So through our goals, we can actually create or undermine the supportive relationships that we want to experience and need to experience for our own health and well-being. And these processes affect our partners as well. So I just want to mention here, although I'm not going to take the time to present the data, we've also looked at these goals in a variety of other kinds of relationships. We've looked at them in romantic relationships. We've looked at them in marital relationships. We've looked at them in just random friendships of students out, sitting in the Oval on the Ohio State campus, coworker relationships. I have a graduate student who's actually looking at how these relationships work when the goals are the instructor in a course, and how do they affect students' experience and perceptions of the instructor's effectiveness and relational quality of the instructor. So we find that these goals, it's not just something that's very unique to roommate relationships. It happens in lots of different kinds of relationships. The other thing I wanted to mention about these findings before I move on to my second question is that one question that often comes up is, well, if I have these compassionate goals, right, and my partner doesn't, then I could get taken advantage of, right? So does the benefit of my having a compassionate goal depend on my partner also having a compassionate goal? So this is when people feel like, okay, I'm willing to do that and maybe take the risk of being exploited or taken advantage of in some way, as long as the other person has a compassionate goal. So in our data, we go back and look at, does the effect of actors' compassionate goals depend on what their partner's goals are? So rather than an actor's 2 goals interacting with each other, does the actor's goal interact with the partner's goal to predict these kinds of outcomes? And it does not. So it just has never been a significant interaction between the 2 people's goals. So it seems as if either person's compassionate goal can be the starting point, and either person's self-image goal can be the starting point of these relationship dynamics. In the kinds of data I've talked to you about today, the compassionate goal effects are always stronger, which is actually a little bit of a hopeful thing. There might be other outcomes where it's not stronger, but in these kinds of variables, the compassionate goals have the stronger effect. So then the other thing to note about this is, in this concern about will I be exploited or taken advantage of, is that actually, if my partner doesn't also have a compassionate goal, actually your compassionate goal is predicting increases in your partner having a compassionate goal. So if you want your partner to have compassionate goals, perhaps the most effective way to get there is to start out yourself by having a compassionate goal and let these positive dynamics unfold, and actually your partner will actually feel higher relationship quality, be more responsive to you, and have more compassionate goals also for the relationship. All right, so let me turn in the remaining time I have to this question about what actually improves our well-being. So I've shown these dynamics where when you have compassionate goals, you give more. When you have self-image goals, you give less. And other people notice and they reciprocate. So both of these things are going, people are both giving and receiving when they have compassionate goals. They're giving and receiving less when they have self-image goals. So which of those things is really responsible for the effects of relationship dynamics on relationship support on well-being? So we have looked at this phenomenon in both anxiety and depression, a composite of anxiety and depression, because those two things were highly correlated with each other. And we've also looked at it in the context of self-esteem. So we'll see if I have time to talk about all of that in the remaining time today. So when we looked at this in the context of anxiety and depression, I'm going to report data from the individual 10-week study. No, sorry, this is a dyad 10-week study looking at changes in anxiety and depression from pre-test to post-test. Okay, so it's, again, as always, we start with compassionate and self-image goals. Here it's actors' compassionate and self-image goals. And are they predicting change in the support that actors give and change in support that actors receive? So we've already addressed that question in a different data set, so now we're looking at it again. Hopefully it will replicate. And then we'll look at the consequences for well-being. So first of all, we looked at whether actors' chronic compassionate goals averaged across the 10 weekly reports predict increases in the support that actors give to their roommates and support that actors receive. So there's a couple of things we're looking at here. So are compassionate goals directly predicting support that you give, controlling for support that you receive? And are they directly predicting support you receive, controlling for support that you give? Right? So what's happening, what's really causing what? And what the model I showed you on support suggested that its compassionate goals predict increases in the support you give, which in turn predicts increases in the support that you receive. So that's what we're predicting, and in fact, that's what we found. Actors' compassionate goals predict increases from the beginning to the end. This is over about 10 to 12 weeks in the support they said they gave to their roommates. And of course, support that change in the support you say you give is strongly associated with change in support that you say you receive from your roommate. We also looked at the role of self-image goals here. And self-image goals, I'll just put that number up here. Self-image goals did not predict change in the support that you receive in this data set. And these cross paths were not significant. So when we control for support you receive, self-image goals don't predict change in support you give. And when we control for support you give, compassionate goals don't directly predict change in the support you receive. So it really does seem to be through this pathway of compassionate goals predicting increased support given, which predicts increased support received. So now the really important question here is, which of these is predicting increases in well-being, if any? So we looked at change in distress, which is a composite of anxiety, symptoms of anxiety and depression from pre-test to post-test. And we found that the more the support that you gave increased, controlling for the support you received, right? The more the support you gave increased, the more your symptoms of depression and anxiety decreased, right? So giving support predicts decreases in anxiety and depression, controlling for what you're receiving. On the other hand, receiving support did not predict significantly predict change in symptoms of anxiety and depression. So actually what seems to predict change in distress is not what you're receiving from your relationship partners, it's what you're giving to your relationship partners. So it's not the subjective experience of having received, it's your change in your own reports of what you gave to another person. So this might seem a little bit surprising, but we were also interested when we actually, I have to thank Laura King here, who's responsible for the fact that this paper got accepted at JPSP. And when we did this study, we looked at the effects of partners' goals to see if do your partners' goals actually make any difference in terms of your own symptoms of anxiety and depression. And it turned out they did not. So we were sort of disappointed that we didn't have any interpersonal process going on here. But as we thought about it, we thought, well, there might be a route through which your goals affect change in other people's anxiety and depression. And the reason is that change in support people give predicts decreases in anxiety and depression, and change in support they give is related to change in support they receive. So maybe when you give to people, and we've seen that people tend to reciprocate what they receive, so maybe when you give support to another person, it reduces your own distress, but also the other person notices and they reciprocate, so now they're giving support, and that might be reducing their own distress. Right? So you can actually reduce another person's anxiety and depression by giving to them, not because they benefit from receiving your support, but if they reciprocate, that's going to be good for their mental health. So we tested that hypothesis. So we again we've already looked at this, these two pathways where actors' goals are predicting change in the support that actors give to their roommates. Change in the support actors give is predicting change in the support their partners report receiving. So we've already kind of looked at those pathways. Then that predicts change in the support that partners say they're giving back to actors, right? So we're replicating that nice positive dynamic in relationships. Then the question is, does that affect partners' distress? And you should not be surprised to discover that the more that partners give, the less distressed they are. So in fact, actors can make their partners less distressed. Actors with compassionate goals do make their partners less distressed by kicking off this dynamic of support exchanged in the relationship. And it's what actors give that reduces actors' distress and what partners give back that reduces partners' distress. So let me turn to one final dependent variable. And this has to do with your own self-esteem and the self-esteem of your roommate and the regard that your roommate actually has for you. So how do these goals affect these kinds of dependent variables? So I'm going to ask 3 different questions here. And again, these are from the 10-week roommate study. So we're looking at people, change in these variables, like change in self-esteem, change in what your roommate thinks about you, change in your roommate's self-esteem over 10 weeks. And we're finding that actors' goals predict change in how responsive actors are, actors' reports of how responsive they are to their partners. So we've already seen effects like this. This is a different data set from the one I showed you earlier. So the more actors have compassionate goals, the more their responsiveness to their roommate increases from pre-test to post-test. The more they have self-image goals, the more their responsiveness decreases. And change in actors' responsiveness predicts change in actors' perceptions of how responsive their roommate is back to them. So when I'm responsive to you, I think you're being more responsive to me. So that's a pretty robust effect. And then we look at whether that's actually perceiving that my roommate is more responsive to my needs, predicting increases in my self-esteem. However, it doesn't work. So then we said, well, so it's not, we know that actors with compassion goals are being more responsive, and they think their roommate's being more responsive to them, but thinking your roommate's responsive to you does not boost your self-esteem, doesn't predict increases in your self-esteem, but what does? Well, it turns out that there is a direct effect from change in actors' responsiveness to their roommates to change in actors' self-esteem, and that doesn't change hardly at all when we control for a change in actors' perceptions of how responsive their roommates are to them. So it's very similar to what I showed you with anxiety and depression. It's really the responsiveness you give to the other person that predicts increases in your own self-esteem, not how responsive they are to you. So what about what your partner actually thinks about you? So when actors have self-image goals, they're trying to boost the esteem that their partners have for them. So does that actually work? So again, we have this pattern where actors' goals are predicting change in how responsive actors say they are. Now we have change in actors' responsiveness predicting change in their partners' reports of how responsive actors are. And again, even though this is over a much longer time interval, we're still seeing a pretty strong association between those two residual change variables. So when actors say they're getting more responsive, their roommates say that actors are indeed getting more responsive. And that's predicting change in partners' esteem for actors. So the more partners think that actors are responsive, the more partners actually like. So this is actually the self-esteem scale, but instead of self-esteem, it's esteem for my roommate. I think my roommate is a person of worth, at least on an equal basis with others. Items like that. So actors' goals are predicting change in the esteem their roommates have for them, but what's interesting is that actors who are trying to control how their partners see them are not succeeding, right? Because they're less responsive, their roommates notice it, and their roommates' regard for them goes down. But when actors are actually focused on the other person's needs, they're more responsive, their roommates notice it, and their roommates' regard for them increases. All right, so one final analysis, a path analysis I want to show you. And this is, well, what happens to the roommate's self-esteem? And what we see, again, so you've seen these pieces already. Actors' goals are predicting change in actors' responsiveness, and roommates notice the change in actors' responsiveness. And when roommates perceive that actors are more responsive, they're more responsive in return. And now you should be able to predict what happens. Roommates being more responsive to actors is actually predicting increases in the roommate's self-esteem, or partners. So actors' goals are predicting change in actors' responsiveness. Partners notice it. Partners are more responsive in return. And it's partners giving that responsiveness back to actors that's predicting increases in partners' self-esteem. So your goals can actually make the people around you less anxious and depressed and higher in self-esteem, or more anxious and depressed or higher in self-esteem, depending on what goals that you have. All right, so let me just wrap up. I have two very simple points I'm trying to make today. First of all, we can create support by giving it to other people. We can create responsive relationship partners by being responsive to them. And we can create belonging by giving it to other people. And this will make us happier and I think healthier, although we haven't included health variables, just symptoms, and it works for symptoms, self-reports of symptoms. So it makes us happier and healthier to be more supportive and more responsive to other people as a result of our compassionate goals. And it starts with our own intentions. Our own goals are our intentions toward other people. So our goals are the starting point in all of these analyses of these unfolding dynamics in relationships, unfolding change in the ways that we feel in relationships, the ways we understand our relationships, how we behave in our relationships, how our relationship partners behave toward us, and our own and our relationship partners' relationship quality and satisfaction. And it's really about what we give, not about what we receive from other people. So I just want to thank especially Amy Cannavello, who's been a close collaborator in every bit of this research and actually was the person who pushed me to start studying roommate dyads instead of just individual people. So actually, she put the social in the social psychology behind my name. And Mary Lou, who was my lab manager, and really without whom this research would not have happened. So, and of course, the Self and Social Motivation Lab, all the people in my lab at Michigan and then now at Ohio State. And I was very fortunate for a period of time to have funding that made this research possible. It's not the kind of stuff I could have done without money to keep our subjects in these studies over time and to have the staff to be able to do this work. And I want to thank all of you for your attention and for being here on a snowy, post-snowy day, and I welcome your questions. This is my lab website if you want any specific papers or want to know more. Ken.
Great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
One thing that seems clear is that self-image goals backfire. They don't really work. So one thing I wonder is why, first, how would they get started, and then why would they be maintained? Because they're not positively reinforcing. So how do you get into this place in the first place, and why do you keep doing it?
Yeah, I've been asked this question a lot, and I think I come up with different answers at different times. So let me try to retrieve the current answer. So I think that the one way to answer this question is that the way these goals work, we're not very good at making the connections that it in fact doesn't work. So I actually have these exercises I do with my students in which they identify their self-image goals and what they do and don't do to make sure other people see them the way they want to be seen and don't see them as the opposite of that. And they can tell you all that stuff, and they seem quite surprised when at the end of the chart, they're actually appearing to be the opposite of what they want to appear, right? So they don't, you know, it's not that it's so all that impossible to see, but we somehow, you know, because we're intending to get one effect, I think we don't put the pieces together. We just get annoyed with the other person when they don't get how great we are, instead of putting the pieces together that actually it's what we're doing. Even though we're trying to get them to see us in a positive light, that it doesn't actually work. So there's like this like clicking into place in people's minds that doesn't seem to happen. So that's one answer. You know, then another answer, so from a more evolutionary perspective, I think you could argue that there are circumstances in which these self-image goals are actually evolutionarily adaptive. Like, so you can imagine encountering a stranger on the street and you don't want to be attacked, so you make yourself look big and threatening, right? So there are ways that communicating a certain image of yourself to another person can be helpful. And you certainly don't want to go into a job interview with the goal of appearing incompetent, right? It's just that the more you have that goal, the more anxious, conflicted, confused you feel, the more you see it's you or me, right? One of us is going to win here and the other is not. And you're not tuned in to the other person and what they need. So it's kind of, it's having these sort of indirect effects that undermine the outcome that you actually want to obtain. Is that? And in these data, these effects are not huge, right? It's not like it's hitting you in the face, the negative effects of self-image goals. They're 0.16, 0.19, 0.2. So they're not huge effects that like you couldn't miss it. If I plotted it on a scatter plot, it wouldn't be like jumping out at us on the screen. And in people's daily lives, it's not the effect they're intending, so they're not looking for it. So I think they just miss the fact that it works that way. Yeah?
It's very stimulating talk. I wonder about the idea of goals as being the terminology, because I'm having a hard time thinking that people actually change their goals. So one thing I could imagine happening is that something good happens to the roommate. They do well on the test. They do well in their, some romantic relation or something. And all of a sudden they start acting more charitably. But maybe they haven't really changed their goals. But these two ways of behaving may differ depending on how you're feeling. Other things that are model. And another way I was thinking about that of goals is like behavioral economics. They talk about different strategies, like tit for tat strategy. Treat the other person the way they treat you is the strategy that works best. And they don't talk about compassionate goals at all. They talk about, in economics, they only talk about personal goals, but the end result might be the same, which is there are different. There's more. The idea of enlightened self-interest
right.
may not be discriminable from compassionate goals.
Okay, so these are two questions. I think they have different answers, right? So the first question was, what's really causing what? And is it really that something else is, it's not really in our analyses it starts with the goals, but maybe it starts with something else. So we have also, in all of these studies, looked at the reverse direction of the effect. So when we find, for example, that my compassionate goals predict change in the support that I give. We're controlling for support at time 1. When compassionate goals predict change in how I feel when I'm relating to my roommate, we're controlling for how I feel on day 1. So we're very often controlling for precisely this alternative hypothesis, which is that how you're feeling is predicting change in your goals. But we also look at that direction, and we find that the more anxious and depressed you are, the more likely you are to have self-image goals, and the less likely you are to have compassionate goals. But we get both directions. Sorry, excuse me. So I think what that means is that you can easily get into these spirals. But people do change their goals. They change them from day to day. They change them. I haven't presented all of the analyses we've done, but when we look at, for example, the effects of we look at the effects of my goals today on how I feel today, controlling for centering out, person centering, I think would be the best way to describe it. So we subtract out your average level of goals. So we're looking at when you have more compassionate goals than you usually do, what is that related to? So, and we find meaningful variance around people's goals from day to day, from week to week, change from pre-test to post-test. So the goals do change, and what's driving change in the goals, I think, and then having these unfolding sequences, I think is a really important question. We have kind of a set of things, so we know that, I believe it is anxiously attached people. The anxious attachment at time 1 predicts increases in self-image goals and decreases in compassionate goals. Low self-esteem predicts increases in self-image goals and decreases in... So those kinds of things, the more worried you are about whether you're okay, that will predict the goals that you have, right? Change in the goals that you have. But controlling for that, the goals are still predicting these other consequences. So when we hold those things constant in a regression analysis, say, okay, let's take out all the variance that's linked to your level of self-esteem or your level of anxiety and depression or how your relationship is doing today or how you're feeling today, we're still finding the goals are predicting all these things. It just doesn't wipe out the effects.
But you think that answering a question on the survey about what your goal is, maybe that isn't their goal, but it's how they are predisposed to answer a question like that. That's a pretty hard to, intractable question, I guess.
Well, it's predicting meaningful things like change, not just today's report, but change from one day to the next in all kinds of things, as we've already seen. So, I mean, the question is, do you believe the reports that people give us? And they're reporting change in behaviors. Their partners are reporting change in behaviors that's related to the goals in very sensible ways to the goals that they told us they had. So, I actually, I think that the amount of data we have showing that the goals are actually, our measure of the goals is actually predicting things, not just my own reports, but other people's reports. I'd be welcome to entertain any alternative interpretation that can actually account for our data.
I wasn't actually,
yeah.
And I wasn't, arguing against the pathways that you're finding, just that, if somebody says, my goal is strictly to help the other person, you have to, I know you can assess what they really want. So, I don't know, I really can't explain it, but if you had a couple of roommates and the first one moved in, first one to get there, and sees that there are 2 rooms and one's better than the other one, if he's really thinking in a compassionate way, is he going to park his stuff in the middle and just wait for the other roommate to get there so they can have a long discussion about who gets the better room? Or is he going to move into the better room because in this case it really is a zero-sum game, and then he can still be more enlightened and compassionate and say, hey, this is a great place, both rooms are great,
Or you could say, I could take the better room, and then my roommate will hate me for the rest of my freshman year in college, right? And is that really what I want? Well, I don't know. I mean, we haven't asked that particular question, but I think that you can still construe it as a non-zero-sum in close relationships.
And there's something in the middle of these 2 theories. I mean, I know
But we always control for one when we're looking at the other. So let's talk some more after, because I think maybe we need to get into some more nitty-gritty details. And I want to answer quickly the second part of your question, which is, okay, so an economist would say, tit for tat, this is just enlightened self-interest. You know, and there are economic theories that say that, you know, the way to get what you want from other people is to be nice to them or generous, and they'll reciprocate, right? We've seen reciprocation is really strong in these data. So that would be a way to get what you want. So you could try to manipulate other people by giving them things as a way to get what you want, but you could also just care about them. And I think that as human beings, we actually have an evolved system for caring about other people, which is the caregiving system, which we need to have or our babies wouldn't survive past infancy. And that we can, so I didn't really get into this aspect of what I think about this, but that the compassion goals are actually tapping a completely different motivational system, which is much more connected to the caregiving system, rather than to, whereas the self-image goals are much more about self-interest and self-protection, and they're connected to the fight or flight, self-preservation motivational system, which is evolutionarily very old. So it's one reason I think everybody has both, because we need them as human beings. As species wouldn't have survived if we didn't have both capacities. But it's true, you could act in a compassionate way as a way to manipulate other people into acting compassionately back toward you. But I think that physiologically and with regard to a lot of other measures, it wouldn't look the same and it wouldn't be experienced the same by other people. So, okay, other questions? Yeah.
I'm kind of curious if you looked at or thought about some of the other individual different characters that are related to these motivational orientation goals, and also whether you found people have similar goals across relationships. I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at that, but I was curious. So I'm trying to, you know, like from the talk, I kind of think, well, one sounds like neuroticism to me. That's the self-image, you know, from the big five.
Yeah, but it's not. It's not. I mean, we've included the big five in our studies, and correlations with neuroticism are really, the strongest association with any of the big fives we get is compassion goals with agreeableness. And that's not huge. It's like 0.2 something or 0.3 something, right around there. So yeah, it's not, in fact, high self-esteem people have self-image goals. Your very smart colleagues who think highly of themselves want other people to know that they're very smart, right? So it's not just a function of insecurity. It's related to insecurity, so it's more extreme in insecure people, but I think it's not just that. So we've actually, across various studies, looked at how these things are related to bunches of narcissism, level of self-esteem. Well, you know, there's lots of significant associations, but none that are. The biggest one that we've ever seen is with self-image goals with public self-consciousness, which I think makes sense. Yeah?
That was extremely interesting talk. And it's been quite a while since I was a freshman in school. But, you know, I'm really a strong believer in, you know, you reap what you sow. And I think a lot of that all comes down to the fact that if you want to really have a good self-image of yourself, then you need to go out and you have to exert yourself and go that extra mile. I mean, actually help others. Isn't that, I mean, it's...
That's precisely what I'm saying. So you reap what you sow is very evident in these data.
You reap what you sow.
And if you want to have close relationships and people who are supportive of you, the best place to start is to be supportive of them and see what happens. You know, not that you do it demanding. It's not you know, putting something in a bank and then taking it back, or, you know, I give you a loan, you have to pay me back. But be giving, and, you know, most of the time you will reap what you sow. Yeah. Yes? So we've never looked at this longitudinally, in the same sample. So we have some samples with people who are older. In particular, we have a study of married couples whose age range is much broader. These are all college freshmen, so their average age is like 18.2 years or something. We haven't looked, I don't know that we have enough couples in our married data to, I wouldn't really trust any conclusions we could draw about change over time. You really would want to do a longitudinal study, and it's an interesting hypothesis. I have to say, one hypothesis would be that people get more compassionate as they get older. I don't necessarily see it, but it would be great if it was true. We have not, just for IRB reasons. When we started doing this, you have to get a consent to follow them up, and we didn't consent them, so we couldn't go back and recontact them. So, yes?
I have two questions. First is, in which relationships the compassionate goals will be more beneficial? Is that more involved in close relationships, or it's like a more reciprocal relationship, so the compassionate goals will be more beneficial, or even like strangers, those kind of relationships?
So the one place where we haven't fully analyzed these data, but we did bring pairs of strangers into the lab, and we tried to manipulate their goals by telling them this is the goal you should have, and people would say they had compassionate goals when we told them to, but they also had the goal to appear compassionate. So we couldn't disentangle those two with strangers who were instructed to have these goals. And with strangers, so we measured their goals, and in this lab study, we didn't see as strong effects. We had some of the same effects, but it wasn't as strong when two strangers were thrown into a room together to have an interaction. It was a support interaction. And so it seems like it's more in the context of a close relationship. But we have found one of my students, Courtney McGinty, is doing a dissertation now where she looks at instructors' goals at the start of the semester, predicting the evaluations their students give them. So using our standardized course evaluations and also some items that she gave people at the end of the semester. And instructors with compassionate goals, in this case to support student learning, are not only seen as being better, more organized, more effective instructors, they're also seen as being warmer and creating a better relationship with the students. So even in that context, which is one person in a position of some authority and a large group of undergraduate students that they're instructing, the instructors' goals at the start of the semester are predicting student evaluations at the end of the semester. So I think it can happen. It can happen at work. It can happen in all kinds of places.
It seems like the intention to involve in your goal, like for strangers, if you do not want to be friends, so you may be more self-image goal, and because if you are a teacher, you're more likely to want to be friends
But actually for the teachers, the goal to appear friendly or even the goal to create a positive relationship with the students didn't have the same effects. It was the goal to support their learning was the only thing that really predicted positive student outcomes. So, yeah, sorry. Okay. Who's dying to ask that question? Yeah.
I noticed that you said that you can roll for gender. I was wondering what, if any, differences in terms of compassion and self-esteem you noticed along gender lines.
So the one finding we get is that women score higher on the compassionate goals measure than men. We don't find any gender differences on the self-image goals scale. But the more interesting, so that's why we always control for gender to make sure it's not something about being female that's accounting for our effects. But the more interesting question is if we, do the processes differ for women and men? So maybe compassionate goals work better for women and self-image goals work better for men or something, some possibility like that. So we always test for interactions with gender. Are the goals working differently, having different consequences down the road for men and women? We almost never find a significant effect, and when we do, it doesn't replicate. When we have the same kind of analysis in 2 different studies, we get it in one, maybe at a barely significant level, and then it's gone. So I think what we're seeing is occasional, if you test an interaction with gender enough times, and about 1 in 20 times, you'll get a margin, it's a p point less than 0.05 effect, but just by chance. And that's about the level at which we see gender interactions. So the other thing about these data, it's really kind of surprising because we always look at whether this depends not only on gender, does it depend on relationship quality, does it depend on how long people have known each other, does it depend on all kinds of self-esteem, does it depend on attachment style, and we almost never see those kinds of interactions. It's extremely rare. So it's like these phenomena seem like almost kind of these kind of basic dynamics that happen that aren't easily pushed around by lots of other things that we've measured. All right, thank you very much.